a working. Hey, from the milk house hum to the auction call, these are the folks standing strong and tall. Yeah, this is the Bullvine coming on the air, sharing the stories of the folks who care. Profiles of passion, voices of the trade, dairy strong legends being made. Yeah, this is the Bullvine coming on the air, sharing the stories of the folks who care. Profiles of passion, voices of the trade.
I mean, 65 people out of nearly 8,000 just signed away a century of dairy democracy in a hotel ballroom.
And almost nobody even noticed. It's just...
That is 0.8% of the membership. Welcome back to the Bullvine Podcast, where we cut through dairy industry noise.
Right. Today we're getting into the silent surrender of Holstein Canada's governance and what it actually means for your operation.
Because, if you're sitting in the tractor right now listening to this deep dive into the source material, you might be wondering why you should even care about a stack of corporate bylaws.
Well, you should care because this organization basically controls the data pipeline for your entire herd. I mean, they dictate the classification rules.
Right.
They manage the genetic registry, and they take a pretty significant cut of your operating budget every single year to do it.
Exactly. So we need to set the scene here. This all went down on April 18th, 2026, out in British Columbia.
And geography plays a massive role in this. The vast majority of dairy producers in this country are clustered in Ontario and Quebec, right? Yeah.
So when the national meeting moves all the way out west, attendance just plummets.
It becomes a totally self-selecting room. You are only getting the people willing to buy a flight, book a hotel, and leave their farms for 3 solid days.
Which is how you end up with only 65 voting members in the room for an association of nearly 8,000.
Right.
And on the voting screen at the front of that ballroom, they presented a wholesale rewrite of the bylaws.
And they didn't just tweak a few rules here and there. This was a structural demolition of how the association operates. 65 votes in favor, and the entire governance model changed.
The sharpest cut is Section 4.15 of the new bylaws. I want to read the exact quote from the reporting so there is zero ambiguity.
Okay.
It says, quote, "Resolutions are not binding upon the board."
Which, let's translate that to barn reality. Historically, how does a resolution even work in a grassroots cooperative?
Well, historically, a resolution is how the grassroots tell the executive what to do. You draft a proposal at your local county meeting.
Right. If it passes there, it goes to the provincial branch.
Yeah.
And then if it passes there, it goes to the national AGM.
You stand up at a microphone, you debate it with your peers, and if you get a majority of the membership to vote for it, the board is legally mandated to execute that policy.
Exactly. It is the core mechanic of farmer control.
But under Section 4.15, that entire process is just gutted. Any vote you cast at an AGM is now, legally speaking, nothing more than a polite suggestion.
A suggestion the board can completely ignore.
They could take a resolution that passes with 90% support, smile, thank the members for their input, and just throw it straight into the garbage.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Running a modern multi-million-dollar data organization requires agility, right? You can't have 8,000 farmers micromanaging every single software update or hiring decision through slow AGM resolutions.
Right.
Isn't Section 4.15 just a necessary evil for corporate efficiency?
Corporate efficiency is fine if you are a publicly traded tech company. But this is a member-owned cooperative. The entire premise is that the members own the asset.
Right.
And if you sever the members' ability to mandate direction, you aren't really an association anymore.
Exactly. You become a private company with a captive customer base. Agility without accountability is just autocracy.
Well, to be fair, the members did pass 7 resolutions that very morning. They passed the one on Cow of the Year weightings at 71%.
Right. The resolution to lower the minimum classification threshold, so influential cows under 92 points can still be nominated, which is a smart change that reflects how modern farms actually use matriarch lines.
Yeah, but again, what good is passing that resolution if the board holds the legal right to completely ignore it?
You're right.
You are celebrating a victory in a game where the referee just announced the score. Doesn't matter.
And if you think Section 4.15 is an isolated overreach, you just have to look at the rest of the document.
Oh, you mean Section 2.05? This one is genuinely alarming.
Yeah.
They gave the board unlimited borrowing and mortgage authority on association property.
Stop and think about the mechanics of that for a second. In the past, if an association wanted to take on massive debt or, say, mortgage its physical headquarters, they had to bring that to the membership for a vote.
Right. It requires a stated cap and a clear business case.
Now, no member vote required, no stated cap whatsoever. The board can borrow against the association's assets to the hilt behind closed doors.
So if the board is securing unlimited borrowing power, the natural question for a producer is, what exactly are they planning to buy?
Or, more concerningly, what financial hole are they trying to cover up?
Exactly. And we will definitely get to the financials because the balance sheet explains a lot of this panic. But first, look at Section 5.05.
The director appointments.
Right. This allows the board to appoint up to 2 of their own voting directors.
Instead of those directors being elected by the actual farmers.
Fred Hofstra from Alberta actually stood up at the mic to flag that specific rule. He warned the room that giving a board the power to handpick voting members is a massive risk.
He is completely right. When a board can appoint external voting members, they insulate themselves. They can dilute the voting power of the farmer-elected representatives with handpicked corporate allies.
You just cannot blindly trust a board when they start designing their own electorate. And the irony of the timing here is staggering.
Rob Bumstead from Ontario pointed it out on the floor, right?
Yes, because literally minutes before they passed this governance rewrite, the room had just approved a separate bylaw, finally giving remote members the right to vote electronically.
Wow, it is so cynical. They approve electronic voting for the thousands of farmers stuck at home, but before those farmers can actually log in and use those new rights, the 65 people in the room push through a measure making all future votes non-binding anyway.
It was a surgical strike. By the time the remote farmers get the right to vote next year, their votes will be completely toothless.
And nobody in that room challenged the really dangerous stuff. Hofstra challenged the appointed directors, but nobody challenged the borrowing power.
Nobody challenged the death of binding resolutions in Section 4.15.
If you want real-world proof of why stripping members of binding power is so dangerous, you just have to look at the accountability ghost of 2025.
Oh, the branch insurance disaster.
Yes, this is the perfect case study.
Let's explain the mechanics of this for anyone who hasn't sat on a local board. Across the country, you have volunteer branch boards. Retired farmers, young producers, people who give up their evenings to organize county shows, barn tours, local banquets.
They do the unpaid heavy lifting that keeps the grassroots connected.
Right. And to do that safely, they rely on head office to provide directors and officers liability insurance.
D&O insurance, because without it, a volunteer is completely exposed. If someone gets hurt at a calf rally, or if there is a financial dispute over an event contract and the branch gets sued,
the individual volunteers can be held personally liable.
Meaning a lawsuit could literally come after your farm, your tractor, your personal savings.
Exactly. It is basic governance hygiene to protect your volunteers. But in August 2024, head office sent out an email abruptly canceling that D&O coverage for the branches.
With no warning.
No warning, no transition plan.
So, understandably, the grassroots revolted. At the 2025 AGM, the members used their power to pass a blunt, binding resolution to reinstate the liability insurance immediately.
Which brings us to the 2026 meeting we're reviewing today. I read the entire transcript. I searched for the words insurance, liability, and D&O.
And what did you find?
Total, absolute silence. Not a single mention from the chair, not a word from the CEO, nothing from the finance committee.
A whole year passes, and the board doesn't even provide an update on an issue that is actively exposing their own volunteers to personal lawsuits.
They just ignored a direct mandate from the membership.
And then, at that very same meeting, they have the audacity to ask the members to officially put it in the bylaws that they don't ever have to listen to resolutions again.
And those 65 members said yes.
It defies logic, which means we really need to follow the money. Because when an institution suddenly rewrites its rules to avoid accountability and secure unlimited borrowing power, the answers are always hiding in the balance sheet.
I looked closely at the 2025 financial statements they presented in that ballroom. And on the surface, the narrative they were spinning looked pretty positive.
Walk us through the top-line numbers.
Well, they reported $16.78 million in revenue. Against that, they showed $16.35 million in expenses.
Okay.
add in some investment returns, and the headline number they projected on the screen was a $1 million surplus.
I mean, $1 million surplus sounds like a banner year. If you are sitting in the audience, you see that number and think the association is in phenomenal financial health.
Right. Until the new CEO, Greg Dietrich, stepped up to the podium. This was, without a doubt, the most brutally honest moment of the entire 3-day event.
He had only been sitting in the CEO chair for 5 months. He could have easily just taken the credit for $1 million profit and walked off the stage.
But he didn't. He looked at the room and admitted that the surplus was entirely a ghost.
Explain the mechanics of what he meant by a ghost surplus. Where did that money actually come from?
It wasn't from selling more services. Dietrich admitted they had roughly $780,000 sitting on the books simply because they had massive unspent wages.
Meaning they couldn't hire people.
Exactly. They couldn't fill the vacant jobs, the work wasn't getting done, the services weren't being delivered to the farms, and the money they had budgeted to pay those phantom employees just pooled up in the bank account.
Wow. And Dietrich was completely transparent about it. He stated that if the association had been fully staffed and delivering the services they promised, their actual operational position would be a deficit of $350,000.
Think about that from a producer's perspective. That is like telling your lender you turned a huge profit this month because you just decided not to pay the feed mill and didn't fix the tractor.
Yeah.
It's a complete illusion of profitability.
And it isn't a one-off problem either. The finance chair, Benoit Turmel, put up a chart showing the last 10 years of operations.
That chart was damning. Expenses have outpaced revenues for a decade, with only one brief exception during the peak of COVID when everything was locked down and travel costs basically went to zero.
For the past 5 years straight, the core operational deficit has averaged negative $147,000 annually.
They have been bleeding money on their actual day-to-day operations for 10 years. The only thing keeping the lights on and masking that structural deficit is the reserve fund.
Let's look at that reserve fund because it is the primary safety net. At year-end, it sat at $6.89 million.
And it performed well, returning 9.28% in the markets.
Right. Management announced they are moving the entire portfolio from RBC over to Burgundy Asset Management. Their stated goal is to grow that fund until it can cover a full year of operating expenses.
Which sounds like prudent financial management until you look at the budget they just approved for 2026. It completely contradicts that goal.
Because the 2026 budget projects a massive deficit of $584,000, over $500,000 in the red.
And what is driving that deficit? It isn't research and development. It is severances, management consulting fees, and the hefty legal bills required to write these very bylaws that just strip the farmers of their voting power.
They are actively draining the reserve fund principal to pay the lawyers who drafted their escape from accountability.
But here's where the math really falls apart. That $500,000 deficit assumes a best-case scenario. It relies on a really aggressive, almost illusional revenue assumption.
The classification bet.
Yes. They built this budget on the bet that they will classify 10,000 more cows in 2026 than they did in 2025.
We need to explain why that assumption is so divorced from reality. What actually happened with classification numbers last year?
They went backward. They classified 5,000 fewer cows last year.
So the service is actively shrinking. Let's explain why. Why are farms classifying fewer animals today?
Because classification is incredibly labor-intensive. It requires a farmer to have the cows clipped, washed, and ready for a human classifier to physically walk behind them and score their confirmation.
It takes hours of labor that most farms simply do not have anymore. Plus, with the rise of genomic testing, a lot of commercial producers feel they already know the genetic potential of their heifers without needing a human to verify the udder depth visually.
The market is clearly signaling a shift away from traditional manual classification. Yet this board's grand financial recovery plan assumes they will somehow reverse a massive structural decline and magically classify 10,000 more animals this year.
How does anyone in that room look at an aggressive growth budget for a visibly shrinking service and just accept it?
Well, Pascal Martin from Quebec did catch it. He is a sharp operator, and he stood up at the mic to call out the contradiction immediately.
And how did the board respond to his pushback?
Mostly with corporate jargon. They offered a vague outline about introducing new 4-month classification rounds and offering 2-month interval services for very large herds. They also mentioned hiring a new business development manager.
And then what? Did they amend the budget?
No. They just moved on.
Unbelievable.
There was no recorded vote on the budget concerns, no hard pushback from the floor. The members just swallowed a financial plan built on thin air.
If we contrast what the board is prioritizing, like legal fees and phantom cow classifications, with what farms actually need right now, it brings us to the most frustrating part of the transcript.
Resolution 5.
Yeah. This is the barn test. This passed with an 85% mandate from the members.
It deals with the robotic milking data crisis. For anyone not managing a modern parlor, we really need to explain how absurd the current system is.
If you are milking on a Lily Astronaut or a Delaval robotic system, that machine is a technological marvel.
Oh, absolutely. When a cow walks into that robot, lasers map her udder, the cups attach automatically, and as the milk flows, optical sensors analyze it in real time.
The robot knows the butterfat percentage, the protein levels, the conductivity. It knows the somatic cell count, which is crucial for monitoring mastitis.
It generates highly granular data 3 or 4 times a day for every single cow. But here's the catch. Official milk recording associations refuse to accept that data.
It is maddening. The technology already knows exactly what the cow's producing, but the bureaucracy refuses to read it.
So if a farmer wants to stay in the master breeder program or have their records officially recognized, what do they have to do?
They are forced to pay for a completely separate duplicate testing system through DHI, Dairy Herd Improvement.
Meaning a human technician has to physically drive to the farm, hook up a separate metering device to the robot, collect physical vials of milk, put them in a cooler, and drive them to a laboratory to test for the exact same metrics the robot already calculated that morning.
You are literally paying twice for the exact same information. It is duplicating labor, duplicating costs, and adding immense stress to the cows and the operators.
Right now, Holstein Canada forcing you to do separate DHI testing when you have a Lily robot is like forcing the guy with an Apple Watch to go to the doctor every morning just to prove his heart is beating.
That is the perfect analogy. And this isn't a niche issue anymore. Roughly 20% of all dairy barns in Ontario are running robots now. In Manitoba, it is well over 50%.
Producers are just fed up with the double billing, so they're walking away from official milk recording entirely. They're dropping out of the system.
Which is exactly why Resolution 5 was drafted. It explicitly demanded that the association form a working group to get robotic sensor data validated and accepted as official test data.
An 85% mandate is massive. The members screamed that this is their #1 operational priority.
And despite that overwhelming vote, how did Holstein Canada respond?
With absolute silence.
Yep. They offered no timeline. They didn't name a lead for the working group. They allocated zero budget to solving the problem.
The only thing we heard was a passing mention from the CEO about researching in-house 3D cameras for animal measurements.
Which is a really telling detail, especially because Lindsay Warden, the CEO of Holstein Association USA, was a guest speaker at this very meeting.
And her presentation highlighted exactly how far behind Canada is falling. What was her main topic?
She presented their machine vision project called Build a Better Cow. The U.S. Association is aggressively moving past human classifiers. They are actively using 3D cameras to automate conformation evaluation.
Let's explain the mechanics of that. Instead of a human judging the angle of a rump or the depth of an udder, they use depth sensing cameras to take millions of data points on the cow's physical structure, completely standardizing the score.
It removes human bias, it lowers labor costs, and it integrates seamlessly with modern dairy software.
So during the meeting, an Alberta member rightfully steps up to the mic and asks the obvious question. Shouldn't Canada and the U.S. be collaborating to build one unified machine vision system rather than developing 2 competing platforms?
And Dietrich gave the standard non-committal executive response. He smiled and said they were having similar discussions.
Which basically translates to, we have no formal plan. This reveals a massive strategic vacuum at the heart of the Canadian Association.
If Holstein Canada refuses to accept robotic milk data, and they drag their feet on automated 3D camera classification, what happens to them?
The market simply routes around them. Dairy technology is moving way too fast to wait for a sluggish bureaucracy.
If the association doesn't own the data pipeline, the genomic testing companies, the equipment manufacturers like Delaval, and data aggregators like Lectinet will just bypass them entirely.
By 2035, Holstein Canada might literally be reduced to a third-party contractor. Just a legacy brand doing administrative paperwork while the actual data science happens somewhere else.
And remember the trap of Section 4.15. Because resolutions are non-binding, The board does not have to act on that 85% mandate for robotics.
They don't have to publish a timeline. They don't have to name a lead. They can just let the clock run out while the entire industry moves past them.
There's another detail buried in the 2026 reports that perfectly illustrates this lack of urgency, and it has to do with the demographic cliff.
Oh, you are talking about the Young Leader Program. This single detail tells you everything you need to know about the future viability of this institution.
The association quietly bumped the age range for what they consider a youth member. It historically ran from age 19 to 30.
But the new rules changed it to 21 to 35. Why?
Because the actual youth are not showing up. It is that simple. The 19 and 20-year-old kids coming out of agricultural college do not care about the politics of this association.
They are focused on genomics, robotics, and feed conversion. They view the Breed Association as their grandfather's social club.
So instead of fixing the core engagement problem and offering services that young farmers actually value, the board just redefined the word youth to include fully established adults in their mid-30s.
It is entirely cosmetic. If you read the transcript of the people debating at the microphones, like Hofstra, Martin, Bumstead, Hawthorne, the institutional memory in that room is incredibly deep.
These are men who have built the breed over decades. But the institutional future is non-existent.
There was not a single person under the age of 35 who stood up to speak on this massive governance rewrite.
The next generation is inheriting a set of bylaws that explicitly strips away their voting power, and they weren't even in the room to realize it was happening.
Which brings us back to the most complex variable in this entire equation. The CEO, Greg Dietrich.
He is the wild card, because on one hand, we really have to give the man credit. He stood up in front of his employers and was brutally honest about the ghost surplus.
That took real guts. It is rare to see an executive voluntarily expose a structural deficit when the accounting allowed him to just claim a victory.
He is also actively trying to modernize the internal operations. He pushed the investment portfolio to Burgundy to chase better returns. He budgeted the severances necessary to clear out legacy management, and he is hiring specifically for business development.
He also made a very visible personal effort to speak French during the meeting,
which is absolutely critical when 43% of your national membership is francophone. The lack of bilingual service was a massive point of friction at the 2025 AGM.
The Quebec delegation demanded a full-service delivery audit last year, which the board quietly buried, but Dietrich is at least making the personal effort to bridge the language gap.
He appears to be a highly competent, modernizing CEO.
I completely agree. He might be exactly the leader the association needs right now. But here is the fatal flaw in relying on a good CEO. He just operated a meeting that completely stripped away all of his structural guardrails.
Look at Section 2.09 of the new bylaws. This rule gives the board sole discretion to write operating policies for elections, disciplinary actions, and director conduct.
They don't need member approval to change how an election is run. They are asking the farmers for total blind trust.
The fundamental theory of a cooperative is that the members are in charge of the board, and the board is in charge of the association.
Dietrich actually used that exact phrase during his presentation. He told the room, quote, "The pyramid is reversed." He meant that the grassroots are at the top, dictating downward.
But the bylaws they just passed dictate the exact opposite. There's nothing in this new legal framework preventing him or the board from completely changing their minds tomorrow.
The guardrails are just gone. If Dietrich leaves next year, the next CEO inherits unlimited borrowing power, appointed directors, and a legal mandate to ignore member resolutions.
So, if you are a dairy producer listening to this, what do you actually do with this information? How do you protect your operation?
We have 3 practical takeaways for your farm based on this deep dive into the source material. First, this week, if you sit on a local or provincial branch board, you need to call head office and verify your directors and officers' liability insurance immediately.
Do not assume you are covered. Ask for the policy number and the coverage limits in writing. If they cannot provide it, you might be completely personally exposed, and you really need to suspend branch operations until you are insured.
Second, next quarter, you need to start evaluating how your farm independently manages component and confirmation data.
If the official breed association pipelines become irrelevant to your robotic setup, you need a private data strategy. Figure out how to export and utilize your Leli or DeLaval data internally without relying on the DHI middleman.
And finally, the long game. The provincial branch federations need to coordinate and force a special general meeting.
You have to demand electronic voting be implemented immediately, and you must explicitly challenge Sections 2.05, 2.09, and 4.15.
If the grassroots do not organize this pushback before the 2027 AGM, that meeting just becomes a rubber stamp exercise for whatever the board has already decided.
It will be a ratification meeting, not a deliberative one.
Before we wrap up, consider this final thought. If data is the new milk, and these legacy breed associations no longer control the data pipeline, are we watching the end of breed associations globally? Or are we just watching their slow transition into toothless lobbying groups?
I mean, think about that the next time your milking robot flags a mastitis case and the association requires you to pay a technician to prove it.
That's the Bullvine Podcast. For the full reporting and more straight-talking dairy analysis, head to thebullvine.com.
Subscribe wherever you get podcasts. We'll get you on the next one.